Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I realized that not only can the Presbyterians bring inspiration and hope, hopefully, through what I have to say, but as we were going through those statistics this morning, I noticed it was kind of like this. Well, you know, we close 4 churches a month, but the Presbyterians, they're closing 9. I noticed that. So I'm glad we're able to bring hope in the fact that you're not quite as bad as we are at this point. And hopefully we can learn from each other in other ways too. So it's a very snarky title that in Julia came up with the title. I bet you're probably not surprised at this point, but what is it? Get over your yard sales?
No,
rummage sales. Okay, well, oh, it's not a yard sale, it's rummage. Okay. Doesn't go. Rummage. It's good to know. Good to know. Yeah, that came about because, you know, when Julie and I were Skyping, we were kind of checking each other out. She was checking me out more than I was checking her out, because basically I would do anything for the love of the Episcopalian Church in a check. So, but she was checking me out to see if this would be a good match, and I was telling her a story about how I was doing a presentation. It was actually a series of presentations for the Episcopal Church, and I brought up that we had a rummage sale that did not make the generational shift. We had people in an older generation who loved the rummage sale. They lived for the rummage sale. The rummage sale took 12 months. It started the day after the rummage sale ended. And everybody would bring their stuff to church, and it would begin collecting in my office closet. And then it would get into my office files, and then it would start creeping into the Sunday school rooms until by the end of the 11th month, the children had to all go into one room because the rummage sale was taking over the entire church. Well, it just wasn't making the generational shift. And people were getting really angry and frustrated at these younger moms and these younger people who would come in, and they didn't want anything to do with the rummage sale. And so it became this like intergenerational tension because you know, all of a sudden, all of the young moms and the young dads and the young men and women who came to our church, they were slackers because they wanted nothing to do with the rummage sale. They weren't as committed to church and committed to God as the older generation was, because they didn't have this commitment to the rummage sale. And so it went on year after year after year, and the staffing for the rummage sale got more and more scant. And so finally, we had to start thinking about the rummage sale. And there were a lot of things that were going into the transition for the rummage sale, but one thing we had to start thinking about was maybe next year we wouldn't have one. It was awful. It was awful. But anyway, so I told this story to this conference, and then I was taken aside later on and told, could you not bring up the rummage sale thing? Because we make a lot of money off of rummage sales. Just drop that one. Just drop that one. So Julia said, we can get over our rummage sales. If it helps us to go from generation to generation, we can get over the rummage sales. So after hearing that, I felt good about being with you all here tonight. And I have learned so much just sitting around, hearing all of you speak. We know from generational theory, I tend to look at the future of the church in the lens of generations. And the reason why is because you saw that chart this morning. It's like, you know, people who are 65 and older had a bar graph this big, and 55 and older had a bar graph this big. When you get in the 30s and the 20s, like the bar gets really, really tiny, which tells you something. It tells you that in 20 years, we're going to be in bigger trouble, right? Unless we do something. And we can do something. And so I think of the future of the church. When I think about where we're going to be in the next 20 years, I often think in terms of generations. And sometimes that means a particular age. Sometimes it means a cultural shift and a cultural change. But when you think about particular ages, oftentimes I rely on the studies of William Strauss and Neil Howe. You've read that book, Generations? It's like 100 pages. It's now probably 15 years old. So they've done better research or maybe not better, but more recent research too. But what Strauss and Howe will say is that the generation that's coming up is very civic-minded. And the generation coming up, when I say that, I mean people who are 29 and younger. These are the millennials. So they'll say that they're very civic-minded. They're pretty institutionally minded. They think a lot about the community. So for those of us who track this pretty regularly, we've been looking at this and we kind of figured a couple things would happen. And Strauss and Howe kind of, they're predicting this because they're comparing generations on a cyclical model. So they're saying that people in their 20s are kind of like that greatest generation that built so many of our civic institutions. And so many of us who look at the church generationally have been waiting, wondering if these 20-year-olds will start coming to our churches, the mainline churches. We're rather progressive. This is a pretty progressive generation. We know that we have we've been doing a lot of the work on the ground to build our civic society. So we've been kind of waiting for this to happen. It's not happening. And now I'm starting to wonder about Strauss and Howe's research. If anybody knows, if there's anybody else questioning this, I would love to know. But we saw, you know, they predicted that some major event would happen and it would unite them together and make them more civic-minded. And sure enough, September 11th happened. And then the Obama ran for office, and we saw 20-year-olds come out in record numbers, much more than my generation. I'm part of Generation X ever did. And we began to wonder, okay, is this the start of a new civic-minded generation? And will this generation start coming to our churches? And we were anticipating it. And yet, we've seen something happen. All of a sudden, they got Obama into office, but there's been this frustration with what's happening and this cynicism that we haven't seen since Generation X. And we have this frustration that seems to be coming out in movements like the Occupy movement, and this yearning, this longing for something else. So I'm wondering, maybe they're still civically involved, but maybe what's happening is they want to create their own things. They want to create their own stuff. They want to create their own institutions. And if we take this cyclical model, if we buy into it, isn't that what that first generation of greatest generation civic-minded people did? They created their own stuff. So I'm wondering where that leaves us. Obviously, a new generation still doesn't want our yard sales. So what are we going to do? They don't want to play any of our reindeer games. We realize right now, coming up, the largest growing percentage in younger generations are the nuns. And that's the N-O-N-E-S, the nuns. The spiritual but not religious. People who are longing for spirituality, who are longing for some sort of connection with God and community, but they're not finding it, or they don't know to find it in our institutional churches. But there seems to be three things that are happening. And we see it in different ways. There seems to be this longing for community, this longing for creativity, and a longing to change the world. We see the longing for community. And I'm going to shift a little bit because this isn't just in younger generations, but we see this happening all around. Because in the last 40 years, we have been inundated by a bigger is better culture. I get this from that book, Deep Economy by Bill McKibben. He's been writing so many interesting things lately, but he talks about this bigger is better culture. And you know, you've seen it. We had the downtown in the small rural community, and then we had the Walmart come in, and it closed down the downtown. And then the Walmart became a super Walmart, and then it closed down the downtown and the grocery stores. And we've seen it with our bookstores, where community bookstores, where we came together not only just to buy books, but to have discourse, intellectual discourse, to be able to challenge each other, to read with one another. These centers became replaced by the Barnes and Nobles and the Borders books, mega bookstores, because bigger is better. We saw it with even our food, what was landing on our table. It didn't come from the local farmer, but it came from the agribusiness and was brought to us. This bigger is better culture, it even came to our churches, right? We had small congregations which were thriving, and all of a sudden we started having these mega churches looming over us. They began to come into town, and we were wondering what we were doing wrong, and we started like going to Willow Creek conferences on the sly, hoping nobody would notice us. And even as a Presbyterian, just starting out, I remember going to, I would go to church growth, and they weren't talking about like 10% growth over, the year. They were talking about how to become a 1,000-member church. And everybody who was speaking was talking about becoming a 1,000-member church or a 2,000-member church and how you could do this overnight. And we quit planting churches. We began launching churches. And everything became bigger is better. And one of the interesting things that I've learned about these mega churches, which I didn't know, many of them were begun by debt. And so that's how they would afford, a lot of the great technology and everything, was they would go into debt. And then that made them evangelize a lot. In fact, they would call evangelism feeding the beast. And the beast was the debt. I learned that from, a few conversations, but it was a business model I had not been aware of. But now you see why places like Crystal Cathedral aren't quite making it anymore. We had this bigger is better mentality looming all around us, even when it came to our sacred spaces and our sacred communities. And in the midst of that, we've found a longing for community. And we've found people who are ripping up their lawns and starting little gardens in their own lawns, or they're starting community gardens because they want their children to know that food comes from the ground, not the plastic container. They want their children to know how it's grown, and they realize that when their kids have a part in growing the food, then they're much more likely to eat the food. And they began forming smaller communities, and in fact we see in church communities, you talked about studying Phyllis Tickle in the Great Emergence. These emerging churches are often very small congregations where people are coming together and just studying with one another, very tiny communities. And we see community forming up on social media. All of a sudden, people are using things like Facebook and Twitter in order to create community. And so now people don't talk on the phone with one another anymore. They may text, but if I want to know what my husband's doing, I check Twitter. Because people are beginning to form community in that way. A lot of us can sit around and say, well, that's not really real community. But I think if you're involved with it, I think you'll know that it is. And in a new generation, when young adults often have to move from place to place to place in order to find education, in order to get a job, and many times they're ripped out of their place where they grew up, they're ripped from their family of origin, and they go off to school, and then they go somewhere else to get their first job, and about every 2.5 years they have to move again and again and again. Isn't it amazing that that generation has figured out a way to stay connected to community, even when we have to move over and over again? A yearning for community. We can see it as these small gatherings spring up, as we see people using social media well. We can see it in our food practices. We can see it as people long for smaller study groups and book groups. The bigger is better mentality is breaking down here and there. Now, am I saying that no young people like to go to megachurches anymore? No, there are some. But don't discount your congregation if you're small. You just don't have to do that any longer. None of us ever had to, but you certainly don't have to now. Longing for community. It reminds me of a Pentecost moment where people were gathered together in the room. It's in small communities so often that the Spirit moves, that we begin to speak in different tongues, that we begin to understand a new diversity that we never knew before. And in a new generation, where some of our biggest and fanciest institutions are crumbling, we have this opportunity to create these small communities again. The second thing that I see in all of this is there seems to be a longing for creativity. There were a lot of reasons why the Rummage sale was not making it in our church. But one of the main reasons why was that every time somebody had a new idea, everyone around the room would say, oh no, that wouldn't work, you know. We did that in 1985. Remember that? That was a disaster. It was terrible. And it was almost like they had written an an invisible rule book that outlined everything you should know about rummage sales. And they had put it together, but a new person didn't know any of the rules. And so whenever the new person would bring anything up, it was automatically shot down. Well, if you're new, you only put up with that for so long, right? Right? And then after a while, you realize they don't really need me and I'll stay home. It's not because they're slackers. It's just because their ideas weren't needed. And they needed to have some creativity, to be in charge a little bit, some power, some ability to make things. So I'm wondering if that's what's happening right now, because this seems to be a generation of great protest. But I wonder if it's just because it's a generation that's not willing to just walk into what's already been created before them. But it's a generation that wants to create something new. This is certainly true of Generation X. We're about 30 to 50. Can you believe? Generation X is getting old. So 30s to 50s. I'm going by Strauss and Howe's number. Okay. Like they're all kind of different. It's very different age groupings all the way around. You can Google it and pick out your own numbers if you want. But anyways, so Generation X is getting older, and one thing about Generation X is they like to tinker, and we like to take things apart and put them together in different ways. So if you think about how you used to have a phone, and you used to have a record collection, and you used to have a computer, and you used to have a library of books. Well, they kind of took it all apart and put it back together, and now it's a small little iPhone that we carry around. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. It is a longing for creativity, a longing to take things apart, to put them back together in a different way. And right now, we see that shift happening. And if people come into your church and there's nowhere to budge, there's no way to be able to change any of it, it becomes frustrating. Because after all, most of our churches were really formed and created in that post-World War II time. And they had a chance to decide what church was going to be about. They were incredible at changing church and making it fit for their culture and their generation. And we have a new generation that wants to do the same thing, but often we want them to fit into our culture. The third thing that we see is a longing to change the world. We see this in a lot of ways. One thing we see a lot is cause marketing. Cause marketing, C-A-U-S-E, cause marketing. And you know, even if you've never heard that term, you know what it is. If you buy something pink, what are you supporting? Breast cancer. If you buy something red, what are you supporting? Heart or AIDS, yes. Depending on your generation, usually. If you buy something green, what are you supporting? The environment. You've learned, what did you say? Money. It's all about money, actually. Companies have figured out that if they take a product and if they tie it to something wonderful, then they can sell more. And here we are as congregations, as churches, doing these amazing things and changing the world left and right, and somehow, a new generation doesn't know about it. I mean, think about it. Think about the last 2 months. If you did not know anything about the church, nothing at all, and you only read the newspapers in the last 2 months, what would you think about the church? What have we had? Child abuse, sexual abuse, reproductive rights, fighting. Who wants to be a part of that? Right? How did Starbucks get known for their AIDS research when we've been sitting by people with AIDS when nobody would touch men and women who are HIV positive? How did that happen? Somehow, a new generation doesn't know that when they go to church, they don't just sit there and become entertained for an hour. They're part of a movement for a just society, a movement to help feed poor people, to help shelter the homeless, a movement that's right there on the ground at Haiti when crisis occurs, people who are there first thing when Katrina hits and the last people to leave. Somehow, we have lost that message that we're not about keeping people from contraception, and we're not about sexual abuse, and we're not about restricting so many things. We're about changing the world. And it's not getting out. The things that we're doing, we're not telling people. We have these 3 things that are occurring. This longing for community, this longing for creativity, to create something of their own, this longing to change the world. And church is a wonderful place for those things to occur. Going back to the rummage sale, we have 2 things that are happening in that rummage sale. And Diana Butler Bass writes about this, and she calls it spiritual retraditioning. spiritual retraditioning. And Phyllis Tickle brings that up too, retraditioning. So we have these two things that are entangled into the rummage sale. First of all, we have the custom. The custom is the rummage sale, the thing we have every year, because that's what it means to be our church, to have the rummage sale, right? But there's traditions there, important traditions that really have a lot to do with the identity of our congregations. And the traditions are something that are more historic, more grounded to tradition. Oh yeah, traditions are grounded to tradition. Anyways, they're more historic, they're more deeply rooted into who we are. So the traditions in the rummage sale are the fact that we are good stewardship. We use good stewardship of what we have. It's the environment that we are able to take care of the environment in different ways because we care for our stuff and we just don't put it in the landfill. The traditions were hospitality because people would come into our building who had never been into a church before. 18% of college students have never been to church once in their lives. 18%. So even going into the door is a major thing. We have traditions within that. The younger people in our church would say the labor to production ratio is just way out of whack. Like we're spending hours and hours and hours and hours sorting and pricing and putting everything into different piles, and it's just taking too much time, and at the end of the day we only make a couple $1,000s. It's not worth it. And the older people would say, no, it's not about the money. It's about the time we spend together. It's about how we get to know each other, how we share our stories as we're sorting and as we're pricing. So there was an element of fellowship, of becoming part of each other's lives. That was also a tradition. So right now, we are in places where often our rummage sales and our customs aren't reaching a new generation. Oftentimes, we are not able to make that transition, but those traditions are important, even when we have to cast aside some of the customs that we do. So, can we begin to use the creativity of a new generation? Can we begin to empower them to be able to think about church in their terms? Sunday morning, it may not be the best time. For young adults, their number one job is retail. And if you've ever had a retail job, it's almost impossible to get off on Sunday morning. All of these things are being questioned right now. We're talking a lot about buildings and how our buildings can be retraditioned. And right now, we see a few things that are happening. And I've heard them around a lot of tables today, and I just want to uplift them a little bit. But we have this sense oftentimes that ministers are bivocational, but I think buildings can be bivocational too, right? And churches can be bivocational as well. Are there things in your community that you can begin to ignite to form a deeper community within your neighborhood, within your town? Can you begin that book sharing and that space to have intellectual conversation right there in your building. I've heard of churches that have started restaurants, and within the restaurant, they've used all locally grown food, making sure that they support the farmers in their area. And not only that, but you just pay what you can when you go to the restaurant. If you can afford more, then you pay more. If you can't afford as much, you pay a little bit less. If you can't afford anything, you eat for free. Can our buildings be bivocational? Can we begin to rip up our lawns and start community gardens there, showing how much it is important for us to grow our food and how we care about the environment and how we don't support food traveling for miles and miles and miles before they get to our own plate, wasting petroleum, wasting so much. Can we begin to think about our churches being bivocational? We do a really good job with preschools. I've heard of artist studios, yoga centers. Our church was very much revitalized by Miriam's Kitchen, the feeding program. We feed about 200 homeless people, as was mentioned earlier, for breakfast and for dinner. But it's become more than just a feeding program. Oftentimes, people in our church will say, you know, we went to go save the homeless, and they saved us. Because people know they can become a part of a church that's helping to change the world. Or at least it's helping to change their block and their neighborhood and a small part of their town. It's important that we think of our congregations, our churches, our buildings as a resource that can be used not only to sustain us, but to serve our community and to rebuild some of that community that a new generation is longing for. Oftentimes, you'll see congregations that decide that they would rather have a building than a church. And we've seen it over and over again, right? They'd rather have a building than a church. So they'll stay in that building, and even when they have all kinds of options ahead of them, they opt for the building before they want a church. But some churches are able to let go of the building when they realize that there's no way for them to be able to keep it up, when they realize that they're not able to bring people into the congregation. They're able to let go of it. I have a friend, his name is Timothy, they were able to let go of it, and they moved into a school gymnasium, and they started a new church. I know it sounds tacky, right? But guess what? They have a thriving congregation now. It's pretty amazing what's happened because they were able to let go of that building. Oftentimes I have a dream of there being an eco building. You know, I went to the mall, which I'm from DC, so the mall means that long stretch of lawn in front of the white, yeah, that kind of mall. So I went to the mall, and there were all these houses all on the mall, and I was like, wow, what is going on? And I realized that they were eco houses, and they were kind of prefab. They were fairly inexpensive. They were put up, they were designed by students, and these were the like top 10 designs. They had a competition. And so there were these incredible like eco houses, and you went in them, and everything was made from bamboo, because bamboo is sturdy and yet it grows quite a bit, and everything had lighting in the right places, windows in the right places, so lighting would come in, so you wouldn't have to rely on artificial lighting as much. And they were beautiful. And I looked at that and I thought, what if our churches began to do this? I mean, sometime in New England, they decided that a church looked like a slat-boarded box with a steeple. Like, what if we decided that we wanted ecologically friendly, probably economically friendly too, buildings that actually fit our congregations, who's worshiping inside? What if we began to do that? Nobody's taken me up on the offer yet, though. Nobody's done it yet. Someday it's going to happen. I do have to stop, though, at this point, because I had a friend who does a lot of historic housing and real estate. And she just completely cringed at that idea, because she said, you know, she was like, we 70% of our landfills are filled with building materials. And so she thought it was much, much better to use an old building, if that was possible, than to build a new one and be much more environmentally friendly. I don't know. But we have these incredibly important resources, and we have a longing in a new generation. How can we begin to use that longing for community, the longing for creativity, and the longing to change the world? How can we begin to partner with one another in this new day? I want to stop for a moment and pause for some questions. So she's asking if there's an economic difference between you know, a blue-collar family, blue-collar worker, and probably a lot of the people, not completely, but a lot of the people that we work with are typically college-educated adults. I think that a lot of the longings are the same, and the reason why I think that is because the recession hit younger generations before it hit the rest of the country. And so there's a lot of the same struggles that's happening in a younger generation that's happening in the rest of the country, that's now happening in the rest of the country. Three things happened with a younger generation. The first thing is that student loans became very high for those people who were highly educated. And so now we have students who leave with, like the last figure I heard was $37,000 worth of debt for an undergraduate degree. That's if they're able to finish their degree. Then the cost of housing went up, and now it's petered off in certain places, and also the wages stayed stagnant, and we lost a lot of benefits. I mean, I am so thankful I'm clergy, because none of my friends have insurance and pension. I mean, it's amazing that we still have that. So, and don't take it away. but so many people in a younger generation are really frustrated financially. And now you mentioned intergenerational living. So one thing that's happening right now with younger generations is over half of the people in their 20s are living with their mother and father. So, so they're either living across the country or they're living, you know, in the basement. And this is having a pretty big effect on our churches, because for a variety of reasons, but we've traditionally been the place where people go to get their child baptized, right? So people will come to us after they're married and they have a child. And so since people aren't able to live on their own, oftentimes they'll live with their boyfriend or girlfriend, and then they don't feel like they can go to church, or they aren't married, or they live with their parents, and so they don't feel comfortable going to church because their lives aren't quite together. And it's prolonging marriage. Marriage is people are getting married later and later. So, because you're not whipping out the wedding ring when you're, or the engagement ring, when you're in your parents' apartment, so basement. So, so I think oftentimes right now, even amongst different classes, younger generations are facing a lot of the same problems. Does that make sense? High unemployment rate with younger generations. Yes?
All those things where traditions have been lost.
Yeah, we have an incredible opportunity in our churches because we have intergenerational community, and we're one of the last places in our society that have an intergenerational community. And in fact, we were having a discussion on Twitter the other day. I'm not sure if Meredith, if you were part of this, but somebody was asking if where intergenerational community occurs, and someone said, church and my knitting group. That's it. But yeah, it's definitely a major thing. In fact, I've heard women's groups, I've worked with a lot of women's groups who are like, we meet for Bible study at 10 o'clock every Tuesday morning, and we can't understand why these young people don't attend. Of course, they're working at 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning. But when the women stopped and asked, what do you want? Asked the younger women. A lot of times it was cooking, canning, knitting. It was many of those different things. Another factor in it, I think, has to do with the internet. So you have, I'm not really as into Pinterest as I should be, but yeah, there's places where people used to do crafts in front of their television at home, and it was kind of an isolating experience. But now it's more of a community building experience because you can share with different people over the internet, and you can begin to meet each other as well.
There's a program in San Francisco.
So people who didn't hear that, there's a program in San Francisco that started where people of maybe underrepresented racial ethnic minorities come to the church and teach cooking classes, so Indian cooking or different cooking classes, and that's, we've been able to create community. They've been able to create community through that. We see that a lot at Miriam's Kitchen because we don't just have, we have like really highly trained chefs at Miriam's, and there were two men who, they were 5-star chefs who decided that they wanted to do something more with their lives, and so they began to work at Miriam's. So they have incredibly high standards, and they're incredibly good. And I think a lot of people volunteer at Miriam's not only to serve the homeless, but to learn how to cook. Because we just watch the Food Network, right? I don't cook anymore. Yes, right. And they're often, let's be honest, paying our salaries, right? So you feel torn because you're like, that if you're not going to have a future unless you start really concentrating and focusing on a younger generation, but you also have the needs of the people who are there, which are also very important. So there are a lot of pastors who feel very stretched and exhausted between a 20th century church and 21st century church. Even communicating something, right? Now you have to do paper communication. You may have phone calls. You have to text, you Twitter, you email. Yeah. So it's a lot of work. So my husband, one night, I came home. My husband, he's an ideas guy. So I came home one night and I'm reading my Twitter feed, and he's like volunteered me to host this conference on Twitter. And so it became this hashtag, UNCO. A hashtag is something that makes it's searchable on Twitter to be able to follow a conversation. So there's a hashtag for this conference right now, and there are people who are tweeting this conference. A tweet is 140 characters. If you're on Facebook, it's like a Facebook status update. So it's this kind of constant news stream of information. What's the hashtag here?
BLDGFUND.
There you go. That's the hashtag, in case you want to search for it later. But so this group of people began to talk on Twitter about coming together and meeting together. And we weren't going to have any speakers. We were just going to bring our own gifts and ideas and discussions, kind of like what we did during lunch, but it would be the whole conference. So we got together the first year, and it was about 40 people, and it was really nice. We got back together the second year, and it was closer to 100, 70 to 100 people. And now we're going the third year, and it's East Coast and West Coast. But the thing that's been really wonderful about it is that we've been able to keep in touch with each other through social media throughout the year. And so a lot of things have happened. A new church development has come out of it, 2 ministries. There are 2 other new church developments in the works. And so it's really become this place where people are able to share ideas and support each other in new ministries. And so I know Heather McCain in Toronto, even though we've never met in real life. We will meet soon. And so, so it's a really wonderful community. And a lot of people, including me, have said it's kind of become a family because we help each other write sermons, like you are talking about your son on Skype, and we're able to really be there for one another. I didn't realize what a community it was until my father died. And just having that outpouring of prayer and support and love just meant the world to me. So thank you so much. It's late, and I really appreciate the extra couple minutes. Thank you. Thank you.